had a significant delay in processing speed. And like I said, when you have a delay in processing speed, many other cognitive functions are going to follow. You're going to be impaired attention, concentration, memory. All that's going to happen. In terms of having to, the speech process, if you heard the deposition, the way the thoughts were conveyed were much more in the way of kind of disconnected, disjointed statements. It wasn't that they were not necessarily understandable, but they didn't have any coherent pattern until he was more structured by Ms. Bredehoff to kind of get to the point of the question, which happened throughout most of the deposition. And so you could see there that there was obviously some form of cognitive issue that should not be happening in someone in their mid-50s, and it, probably due to the alcohol and substances.
What, if any, observations did you make about impulse control?
So during the deposition? Or,
yes, or,
okay.
or
any
other
time?
record evidence either.
So again, I think that under the guise of not being acutely intoxicated, I think Mr. Depp was able to control much of his behavior, much of his thinking, even if it was aberrant or negative, he was able to control that. I think that once you start getting to the point of adding substances to that, that will set it over. If you saw the video, I think you all did, about the in the kitchen where there was smashing of glasses, slamming of cupboards, and yelling at Ms. Heard that you don't exist. And throughout the deposition of Dr. Kipper, Mr. Depp is firing him and rehiring him and yelling and screaming. And I do believe that a lot of it had to do with the interaction of, hey, we're trying to help you get sober, okay? And it is obviously something you are resisting, not ready for, not wanting. And so you saw a lot of yelling, a lot of acting out, if you would, which puts you on the state of, hey, this is a gentleman who has really significant trouble with delaying gratification, okay, delaying reward. And certainly one way to make that significantly worse is with substances. There's no question about that.
And you may have subsumed this in, but what, if anything, did you observe relating to erratic behavior based on the record evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, when you talk about erratic behavior, Dr. Kipper's deposition, I believe it was, where, and I think I made a particular note of this only because I'm a psychiatrist myself. There was a very large ranting about Dr. Cowan, who was Ms. Heard's psychologist therapist. And the language, you can be dissatisfied with your provider. I have no problem with that. You could be dissatisfied and you have the right to go to wherever you want to go to. But the texting that were involved in this in terms of erratic behavior was disturbing in terms of the verbiage used, the phrases used. Am I free to use some of the language, or should I reserve that, Your Honor?
Go ahead.
I can?
Believe me, the jury's been hearing it.
Okay, all right, I want to make sure. Jury, I want to make sure. Okay, so it's something along the line that Dr. Kipper is an effing charlatan. He ought to
Objection, hearsay.
He's entitled to rely on it and he's to give his examples.
He can talk about what he developed from the hearsay, but not repeat it himself.
He's entitled to give examples of it.
I'll sustain the objection.
Without giving the exact words that you recall.
Oh, without giving the exact words?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, without giving the exact words, it was basically vulgar language directed towards Dr. Cowan throughout multiple texts, multiple things that Dr. Cowan were doing in therapy. It was, like I said, it was without relaying it, the exact thing. I'm trying to be as accurate as I can. And I think at the end of it, I think he was also talking about that Dr. Cowan was filling Amber with positive thoughts, a therapeutic.
Objection, hearsay.
I think he's keeping it more general, and he's entitled to rely on. Thank you.
So more along the line of giving Amber psychiatric jargon to put on him. And actually, what I read and interpreted what Dr. Cowan's was getting blasted for was he was kind of teaching Amber how to use conflict resolution in a more appropriate manner and learning to express things more rationally rather than express things as irrational as they have been expressed. And for that, there were a lot of negativity being sworn at. So again, erratic behavior in terms of writing and text, but I have no problem with people being angry. Okay, none whatsoever. It's just the expressing of it and the continual ranting of it was very uncomfortable for me to read. But regardless, I think we have seen in terms of erratic behavior much of the psychological and the physical maltreatment we talked about.
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
I don't agree.
Sustain. Next question.
Okay. Mr. Depp is 58 years old. Are the behaviors that you have been describing for the jury, are those typical and age-related?
No, so while I don't consider 58 years old, I'm 59, okay? I will tell you that the age-related changes that occur in humans are very erratic, hit and miss, meaning they'll occasionally be there. You may need a little bit more time to answer a question or pull things out of memory. You're just a little bit slow and a lot more inconsistently slow. You wouldn't describe what Dr. Blaustein's changes were or what I saw in the deposition attributed to age.
Dr. Spiegel, what is Seroquel?
Seroquel or quetiapine is actually an atypical antipsychotic, which is indicated for many things, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, adjunctive treatment for major depression. So it's indicated for a lot of things.
But what effects may it have? I mean, this is one of the drugs that Mr. Depp was taking,
Yes.
correct? It was a prescribed drug?
Yes.
Okay.
So-
yeah, please
So
explain.
the effect of Seroquel is it's very often used as a sleeping agent because it doesn't have a lot of the side effects that are associated with conventional antipsychotics, movement disorders, tardive dyskinesia, et cetera, or at least it's a very low risk of that. So people have used it off-label. Physicians have used it off-label to help them sleep. The problem is the effect is very barbiturate-like, and it really knocks people out, or certainly if you use it at high enough doses it can, okay? And the problem is it also has street value. So it's absolutely used on the street for that downer-like effect, and obviously it's a little bit more readily available because it's prescribed. So it does have that street value portion of it.
And Dr. Spiegel, what effect would this have on Mr. Depp based on the dosages he was taking?
So I think what you're looking at is
Objection, speculation.
Overruled.
Please continue.
what you will see in patients who have substance use disorders are people who unfortunately kind of wake up and fall asleep only through pharmacological assistance, meaning that their own circadian rhythms are no longer in control of that behavior. So you will take stimulants to quote unquote get you up in the morning, and then you will take things like quetiapine, Seroquel to knock you out. So basically what these are being used for is I'm going to get up and I'm going to get knocked out. And that's very characteristic of what would be actually legal prescribed substances. That's not illegal at all. That's very legal. And that's seemingly what these medicines' effect are on patients who have substance use disorder.
Dr. Spiegel, what is Neurotin?
So Neurotin is actually an anti-seizure medicine, which I think it's indicated for seizures, and it might be indicated for one chronic pain condition, although I can't swear that to you. That said, again, in a substance use disorder population, it has significant street value, and people who misuse opiates often supplement that with Neurotin because it has this anti-pain calming effect. So unfortunately, it also can cause respiratory suppression. And so when you use it with opiates, there are people that are lucky enough to succumb to respiratory suppression as a result, but it has a very additive, calming effect that people use it for.
And what effect would this have on Mr. Depp in the dosages he was taking?
Again, I'm still waiting for the objection. Okay, again, what it would do is have the street value of using it with the opiates. The advantage is you're using with opiates, and it's because opiates in general, despite everything else it does, are calming. And you use it with it, it offers further calming, which is why doctors have been warned not to prescribe medications like gabapentin and opiates together unless under significant, strict following, because it can cause serious problems, such as death, respiratory suppression.
And Mr. Depp was also taking Adderall, correct?
Yes.
Can you please describe to the jury what that impact would have, and particularly in connection with the dosages?
So Adderall is a psychostimulant, which is prescribed relatively regularly for ADHD. The problem comes again when you shouldn't be prescribing or receiving Adderall when you're already misusing cocaine. Okay, you're now doubling your stimulant dosage here. And basically what you are talking about, again, it comes down to in the substance use disorder population, you are using it to stay awake, have energy, keep yourself going, getting high, getting energetic. And then the only way to kind of combat that, because you have this effect, is to kind of take downers during the day, and downers being anything that's calming. So anywhere from opiates prescription, anywhere from Neurotin, anywhere from Seroquel, all medications that are which are abusable. And so that's what this is going on. That's what the substance use disorder patient has, and it can't be given with someone using cocaine, because that's an extreme risk for death. You can't be given together.
And what, if any, effect would these drugs have if they were mixed with MDMA or cocaine?
So when you combine the two together, like I talked about before, there are effects where you are looking at, right, the predisposing traits of intimate partner violence. So jealousy, rapid mood changes, poor self-control, and to some degree, condoning violence to a certain degree. When you combine them all together, you get this disinhibiting, euphoriant effect from cocaine and Adderall. Then when you combine the two together, what happens, you get too much, and then you start getting irritable, you start getting agitated, okay? You start becoming suspicious, jealous, potentially disinhibited, psychotic, and these are the risks. And again, we're talking about not your average everyday use of these substances. We are talking about chronic use together. And we also know that alcohol and cocaine use independently increase significantly the risk of intimate partner violence. These aren't statistics I'm coming up with. They all depend, anywhere from reports up to 7 to 27-fold. So you are, quote unquote, colloquially playing with fire when you are talking about substances and intimate partner violence. You are playing with fire. And that's all of us.
And the substances that Mr. Depp was taking and the record evidence relating to those, did you draw any conclusions concerning whether he met this criteria or these risk factors?
So in terms of substance use disorder, when you look at it, so major role obligations not being fulfilled, don't have any evidence about operating under the influence or not. Social issues, especially disagreements and arguments with your spouse or family. Obviously, there was tolerance and dependence for the amount he was using, because if anyone is naive to these medications, most of us would be dead. Unsuccessful efforts, difficulty cutting back, using more than intended, giving up social, occupational obligations because this, I know there was right after the rehab on the island in Australia when Mr. Depp went out partying with Marilyn Manson and using.
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Actually, that's asking for the record evidence
I'll
for this.
sustain the objection. Next question.
Okay.
What other record evidence did you have supporting this?
So, psychological, using despite the fact it causes known psychological, psychiatric, or medical effects. And I think that's been pretty well documented. So in this case, you're talking about someone who has a severe substance use disorder. I do want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that intimate partner violence and substance use disorders are two scourges in this country. They're two plagues. This is very serious stuff we're playing with. And when you are just getting someone closer and closer to the threshold.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
This is highly relevant, Your Honor.
I'll overrule as to relevance.
Beyond the scope.
Go ahead.
Beyond the scope of the question.
Yes.
All right, I'll sustain that objection.
All right. Tell me more about the relationships between substance abuse and IPV, please.
Yeah, so again, that you are talking about this and you may be able to control the risk factors for any of us may be able to control the risk factors for IPV. Any of us might be able to, okay? When we're thinking and we're not disinhibited, not having these hyper intense emotions from substances. Once you add that to this mix, your brain can no longer do what it's supposed to do. And it's supposed to prevent you from doing this, quite frankly, because it's wrong.
Did you arrive at any conclusions concerning substance abuse and potential self-harm that may have led to Mr. Depp injuring his finger?
So I think the physician before me explained that pretty well, but I'll tell you that Mr. Depp has a history of self-injurious behavior, meaning cutting himself. Mr. Depp has a history of burning himself. I know when the actual event happened, there was texting to Dr. Kipper, paraphrasing, not saying exactly, that Amber and him got into a disagreement related to her wanting him to be sober. And then as a result of that, he said he got so angry, he cut the tip of his finger off. So if you're asking me, can someone who has, or have I seen, and can someone who cuts themselves, burns themselves, can cut a tip of their finger off with or without alcohol or cocaine or the rest? The answer is
Objection
yes.
beyond the scope of the question.
That's exactly what he overruled. Thank you. Please
Was
continue.
it overruled?
It was overruled.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So that is not a very far jump. I've certainly seen patients do a lot worse than that who started out with similar risk factors of, burning self and cutting self. I'm not going to get into the descriptions, but I've seen people do a lot worse than that.
Okay.
So the answer is yes.
Okay. I'm going to turn now specifically to intimate partner violence, and I know you've talked certainly about it. But can you tell the jury, please, a little bit more about intimate partner violence and what is included in that?
So the APA Task Force on Violence in the Family defined more or less this topic of domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, as recurrent abusive behavior by means of psychological, sexual, or physical maltreatment for the purpose of achieving control or maintaining power, authority, and control.
Can it include threats and intimidation?
It includes, so in the part of psychological abuse, which is done essentially as a means of emotionally and mentally hurting someone, but with the same end goal to achieve control, it can be destroying property, it could be financial, which is part of that, verbal outbursts, threats, intimidation, body language, all of that goes under the concept of psychological abuse. And you may be able to divide it, verbal, nonverbal, what's exactly emotional versus verbal, but they're all under that rubric, and they're all under the guise of maintaining control.
Do survivors of intimate partner violence experience mental health issues?
Can you repeat the question?
Do survivors of intimate partner violence experience mental health issues?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So survivors of intimate partner violence, and by the way, I should start out by saying, we don't expect, in psychiatry, we don't expect our victims to be perfect. We don't expect our victims to be unscathed by what they've received. So starting with that, okay, it is not unusual as survivors to see substance use, substance abuse, substance-induced symptoms, chronic depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or subsyndromal post-traumatic stress disorder along the lines of battered wife syndrome, and some emotional unpredictability. And again, you are a victim here. You are a victim.
Do perpetrators typically seek treatment or counseling?
No, perpetrators are not receiving counseling treatment. One, because they're going to be probably having to tell someone that they actually struck someone, which is what their thought is about the big problem about intimate partner violence, is just hitting, again, important, but not the sole part of it. So perpetrators very rarely will go into any type of formal counseling. Victims go into counseling. Victims are seeking actually couples counseling. Victims are seeking couples advice to try to repair what's happening, okay? But in terms of actual perpetrators, no, they don't do that.
In your review of this case, is there record evidence of physical violence by Mr. Depp?
So
Objection, Your Honor.
Would you like to
No
approach?
foundation.
Do you want to approach him?
So what have you reviewed that correlates with the risk factors for IPV that related to Mr. Depp?
So risk factor I reviewed that correlate, so starting with I guess we'll start with the physical because that was the question that was put out there. What I have reviewed has demonstrated pushing, shoving, grabbing.
Objection, Your Honor.
Let me see if I can direct this a little differently, Dr. Spiegel. Rather than giving the summary of what that was, what did you review that correlates? In other words, did you review witness statements? Did you review depositions, photos?
Yes. So what I reviewed was in terms of witness statements, Dr. Kipper's notes. Very, very interestingly, actually, early on in I think it was 2012, or around that time, circa 2012, 2014, Ms. Heard was...
Action beyond the scope of the question.
What he reviewed is the question.
All right, let's see.
So I reviewed so Ms. Heard's...
Objection, there's no question pending.
If he's answering, go ahead and answer what you reviewed. Please continue with what you reviewed.
Therapist's notes, counselor's notes, text messages, depositions, video, pictures, psychologists' notes and evaluations, and I said physicians' notes. That's what I reviewed.
All right. Now, you've indicated that intimate partner violence includes physical violence, sexual abuse, and psychological aggression. Can you please describe for the jury what psychological aggression is and what it entails?
So, I said psychological aggression would be the engaging in behavior for the sole purpose of emotionally and or mentally harming someone, with the main purpose of, again, to maintain control. So behaviors that can occur with psychological aggression include insults, intimidation, holding things financially against someone, jealousy rants, property destruction. So all that is involved, a nonverbal communication, so threatening looks, glances, things like that. All that is involved in psychological maltreatment and intimate partner violence.
What if anything would be psychological aggression if it was trying to control somebody's career? Would that be a factor?
Yeah.
Action leading.
Overruled.
So yeah, I'm trying to control someone's career. That would be under financial, trying to mistreat someone, especially someone wants to succeed and try and have a career, and you're preventing them from doing so by maltreatment. That's another example.
Okay. So I'm going to ask specifically about the risk factors for intimate partner violence. Is substance abuse a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes, it is a risk factor as well as a precipitating cause.
Okay. And what record evidence did you review that correlates to Mr. Depp engaging in substance abuse?
So the record evidence of, I'll just start with Dr. Kipper and the substances that Mr. Depp was using and misusing, both in terms of prescribed and on urine drug screen, were brought out through that.
Okay. Is lack of behavioral control and impulsiveness risk factors for intimate partner violence?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And what, if any, record evidence were you aware of that Mr. Depp had exhibited lack of behavioral control and impulsiveness?
Again, threatening,
Objection. Record evidence.
That correlates with, and I'm on the risk factors at this
overruled.
point. Thank you, Your Honor.
threatening, destroying furniture, property, breaking things, writings on walls, mirrors, writing in blood on furniture. All that would go with that.
Okay, all right. And what, if any, risk factor is narcissism for intimate partner violence?
So a patient, before we get into narcissistic personality traits or disorder, the overall, it's categorized under what's called cluster B personality
Objection,
disorder.
Your Honor, beyond the scope of the question.
He's explaining the narcissism.
Well, I'll sustain objection if you
Okay.
ask a question.
Can you explain to the jury what's involved with narcissism as it relates to the risk factors of intimate partner violence and
So
what that realm is?
So narcissism patients have, again, poor self-control, okay, rapid mood shifts, okay. As a result, they have an undue sense of admiration. They worship power, they worship control. They have lack of empathy, and people are generally kept around as long as they're useful to them. A large sense of entitlement. Anything else? Need for praise. So that would go under narcissistic personality and IPV.
What if any what if any traits would be requiring admiration? Would that fit into it?
Yeah, oh yes, requiring admiration, need to be admired is part and parcel of narcissistic personality disorder. Yes.
Would being envious fit within that?
Yes.
Fragile self-esteem?
Yes.
And what, if any, record evidence do you have that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic?
Well, I do think that the fact that he thought that Amber owed him, Ms. Heard owed him,
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Thank you. Go ahead.
the fact that Ms. Heard owed him and only wanted to be together with him because of his fame is an example of that. I do think the jealousy aspects are an example of that. I do think, as I think Mr. Tillett had testified that, being admired is one thing, but then behind your back saying something else about people is another thing. And I can probably say with a reasonable certainty that to some degree this whole trial is that. Because
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
That's not record evidence. Speculation.
Overruled.
Please continue.
That this whole trial, in terms of narcissistic insult, is what's going on. I believe that Mr. Depp was very much a mainstay appropriately in Hollywood, and then this was pulled the rug without.
Objection, Your Honor. Can
I
we
think
be?
he's able to explain what
I'll
he's.
sustain that objection.
Can you explain what you mean by this whole trial?
Your
This
Honor, can we
proceeding would go,
approach?
Yes.
this court
It
case
is.
would go through, right?
There's an objection, sir.
What other conduct is in the record evidence that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic, having those traits?
Was the thing about the trial rule, I can't
Yeah,
speak.
Your
you're
Honor.
you're not allowed to say that.
Not say that, okay.
Okay.
The only other thing about narcissism that I think in terms of the trial would be in order to maintain any sense of control, a narcissistic person really has to have lack of empathy. Because in order to engage in behaviors that quote unquote are used to keep individuals in control, you don't really think about the other person. You're not really caring what happens to that other person. So I think that's another facet.
So are attitudes accepting or justifying intimate partner violence a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Do some perpetrators in intimate partner violence try to minimize the IPV?
Yes. So it is unfortunately not uncommon, especially during the calm phases of the abuse cycle where there is no increased tension, there is no acting out. Okay, you are talking about more of the honeymoon, apologetic phase, begging for forgiveness, telling them how you're going to change, maybe giving them gifts. And then when the dust settles later in the day, a day or two later, it is not uncommon for the perpetrator to kind of switch the blame over to the victim, saying that, hey, this either denial, this never actually happened, and trying to make me look bad, or an allopathic defense where you instigated it, or an altruistic effect where I'm doing it for you, transformative effect, that society kind of accepts this. So it is very uncommon for all of a sudden for that to start shifting during that time, because it is during the calm phase and everything is relatively calm. This, of course, is when the victim wants to engage in treatment. But beyond that, the ability to kind of quote unquote, for lack of a better phrase, win people over, family, friends, the law. I mean, the very ability to do that is part and parcel of that calm, charming phase where it looks like the victim is, just fabricating this.
And is victim blaming a characteristic?
Yes, like I said, I mean, to blame the victim, that one of the defenses are the allopathic defense comes along with victim blaming. That's what essentially you're doing. I'm blaming you for what you made me do.
Okay. And is there record evidence that you reviewed that correlates with Mr. Depp engaging in this type of behavior?
So I think for a lot of the issues seen, the big precipitant was going to be the need for sobriety. Coming back to that severe substance
Objection, Your
use.
Honor, non-responsive.
I think he's trying to explain it. Thank you. Please continue.
There's severe substance use disorder, and many of their arguments, but what I reviewed in the record, stemmed around Ms. Heard's desire for Mr. Depp to maintain sobriety, and that what was happened. So as a result, she was blamed for, bothering him in a way he didn't want to be bothered, and that triggered what was going on.
Are you familiar with the term gaslighting?
I'm familiar with the term gaslighting.
Okay. What, if any, gaslighting is consistent with intimate partner violence and the risk factors?
So again, when you start being able to when a person starts to be able to be manipulative and charming, you start to be able to win people over, and especially when you see someone who's a victim who is essentially vulnerable, emotionally labile, okay? You see that person, and then you see this calm demeanor in front of you who's very charming, very engaging, very personable, and then all of a sudden it starts looking like the victim is just was essentially losing it, and i.e. they're being gaslighted.
Is there examples where an intimate partner violent perpetrator claims that the victim is the person who's actually committing the abuse.
Yeah, oh, yes, oh, yes.
How common is that?
That's very common. Again, that's part of that is very common in the occurrence of the honeymoon phase and the calm period of the abuse cycle. Very common during that time, where the victim, where they're shifting the blame or anything along that line. That's very common for that to happen.
And you indicated that you reviewed some audio tapes in this case, correct?
Yes.
And what, if any, evidence did you review there that correlates with Mr. Depp attempting to claim that Amber was the one?
Well, I think that was what was said, that Amber was the abuser.
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't understand the objection.
What record evidence?
Overruled.
Thank you. Please continue.
So that claiming that Amber was the abuser in this particular scenario. And what I will reiterate again is that, one, victims are imperfect, and two, it is not uncommon in the context of being a victim when you know that person is about to proceed or relapsing to a substance or going to a substance and anticipating what's going to happen, that you anticipate the next mood and start initiating self-defense. But by and large, that's not what's going on here. By and large, Mr. Depp,
Objection, Your Honor.
behavior was
There's
consistent.
an objection, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. All right. We can move on to the next one. Is prior victimhood of abuse a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
And
So-
go ahead.
There is something known as intergenerational theory of violence, which is basically along the line of observation, imitation, reinforcement. So you observe a behavior that occurred in childhood, you imitate it when you see that there's no significant negative consequences, but you do get the positive consequence of maintaining control of a situation, solving the conflict in your way, if you would. So that theory is, interestingly, it applies to not only the victims, not only the perpetrators, but also the victims, because there are many victims who grow up in a house of abuse that are not abused, but they're the victims of abuse.
What are the warning signs of intimate partner violence?
So warning signs would be increasing the tension, escalations of tension. So that's when you start seeing, hey, partner's getting angry, okay, starting to break down the communication, starting to engage in verbal, nonverbal threats. Victim concedes due to this tension, and that leads you to the actual acts. So these acts progressively build, and then they occur.
What, if anything, have you seen in intimate partner violence about apologies and promises?
So again, the apology is part and parcel of the honeymoon phase, and promises are part and parcel of the honeymoon phase. And, the victim wants to believe it's going to work. They want to believe their spouse is going to be faithful to this. And as part of the abuse cycle, it ends up, as I should say, in the calming cycle, like I said, the victim tries to get some help to try to resolve this until the tension buildup phase where something bothers them. So again, it could be bothering someone about substance abuse. It can be bothering someone about finance. It could be bothering something about your career. Anything is liable to build up tension when you have this framework of limited self-control and erratic, intense mood shifts.
So what, if any, record evidence did you review that reflected Mr. Depp engaging in these warning signs, including the apologies and the promises?
I think that was almost routine, that after it was all said and done, that he would apologize for letting this monster out, letting this anger out, almost routinely. And there's very well record evidence of that starting as early on in the marriage in therapy for Ms. Heard. So that's very common and very much occurred, recognizing what happened. And the other part of this is, again, when you can recognize that when you're sober, even short-lived sobriety, when you could recognize that things are better, things are happening better, life is better, then even that should show you that, hey, there's an issue here. There are issues here that when I don't use can be resolved.
Thank you, Dr. Spiegel. I'm going to now move to the Goldwater Rule. Can you explain the Goldwater Rule, please?
So the Goldwater Rule is when Senator Goldwater was running for presidency, and I'm going to be honest with you, I think it was in the late 60s when he was, early 70s, because I was too young to even follow politics then, so please don't quote me on exactly when it was. But basically what was happening is clinicians, psychiatrists were making these quote-unquote armchair diagnoses from their homes or offices because they saw this person on TV, the way they acted, and were asked to comment about what they think their diagnoses are. And therefore, it was felt that that should not be done by professionals in these public settings.
Does it have any applicability here?
No, it does
Objection.
Why not?
No foundation.
He was explaining what the Goldwater
You
Rule
want to
was.
approach?
Dr. Spiegel, do you remember the question? Does the
think the
Goldwater Rule have any applicability here to your testimony and your conclusions and opinions?
No, it does not.
And
for
why?
Multiple reasons. One, the basics of expert witness testimony would almost be thrown away if you are not allowed to base things on what you evaluated of an individual, what you've read about an individual. So if I'm not allowed to comment on records or charts or information that I look, then expert witness testimony can't be done. But more specifically for this case, in the Goldwater Rule, the pure version of it was the armchair diagnosis of watching someone on TV. Just, you don't make a diagnosis. More recently, I think that's even more recent, we've had examples of that. So you don't make diagnoses like that. This is not the case here, because like I said to you at the beginning, I have reviewed a lot of professionals and their evaluations and their treatment course, video deposition, picture deposition, court filings, emails. I mean, I reviewed a whole lot of things that directly describe Mr. Depp and his behavior. So I'm not commenting on a public opinion, and I have absolutely no knowledge of what's in Mr. Depp's history. If I was just doing that, it would be like watching a movie. That's not relevant here.
And in fact, I think you testified earlier, you invited Mr. Depp to.
Oh, yes.
Give an
And again-
example.
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So to be fair, for an evaluation, for my own direct evaluation, again, I was offered twice that I can do an evaluation of Mr. Depp directly, and both times Mr. Depp and or his lawyers decided that that wasn't going to happen.
Okay. And in fact, the court did not require Mr. Depp to.
No, and the court did not require Mr. Depp to undergo this evaluation.
Okay. Dr. Spiegel, these opinions that you have offered here, do you hold them to within a reasonable degree of medical and psychiatric probability or certainty?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, cross-examination. Thank you, Mr. Dennison.
Sir, I'm Wayne Dennison. We haven't met. But let me ask you, let's start with what you finished with.
I'm sorry, one more time?
Let's start with what you finished with. You understand that the court was twice asked by Ms. Heard's counsel to order a medical exam of Mr. Depp, and those motions were denied.
I think your team told the court you didn't want to have them, and the court ruled on them, right? I don't think the court proactively did it. You kind of had a motion to them, right?
No, when Ms. Heard's lawyers moved for them and asked for them and did not get them. Isn't that right, sir?
If you're saying that's what happened, my understanding of was that you all did not want him to undergo one. They petitioned for it. The court said no. Yes, that's what my understanding of it was.
The court said no to ordering Mr. Depp to do the medical exam.
Right, I said the court did not require it, right.
And there was one that was ordered, in fact, right?
There was,
All right.
All right, so the last thing you talked about was the Goldwater Rule.
yes, sir.
Been around for almost 50 years, right?
Yeah, I'm 59. That sounds about right.
Yeah. And it's been around as a result of a presidential election that you referenced.
Yes.
And who has that rule? What organization maintains that rule?
The American Psychiatric Association.
An association you're a member of.
Association that I'm a member of, yes.
Yeah. Aren't you a fellow or something?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, and this is an ethical rule, right?
It is an ethical rule. And yes, it's ethical. They say rules. It's an ethical guideline. Yes, they're guidelines.
Mm-hmm. And you know that over time, the American Psychiatric Association has amended the rule, so it's not just about diagnoses, but it's also about professional opinions.
Could you be more specific, say, about professional opinion in regard to what?
Well, let me read this and see if you're familiar with it. It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion about an individual based on publicly available information without conducting an examination. That's the rule, right?
If you're reading it directly, I will believe you.
Okay. However, a diagnosis is not required for an opinion to be professional. So my question is, it's not just diagnosis that this Goldwater Rule applies to, it's professional opinions.
So again, I will reiterate that would come down to essentially nullifying witness testimony, expert witness testimony, without a direct evaluation. And as we know, it didn't happen. But regardless of that, the whole expert witness testimony thing would be basically rendered null and void.
The rule, in fact, contemplates that issue, doesn't it, sir?
Again, I'm just telling you the answer to the question. When you're reading me those statements, I'm telling you the response by the other side, who publishes also, is that if that was the case, there could be no expert witness testimony in the courtroom.
Psychiatrists are ethically prohibited from evaluating individuals without permission or other authorization, such as a court order. That's the rule, right?
Again, if you're reading that, then I have to believe you're not misrepresenting it. And I would come back to, again, then this whole thing on we might as well get rid of all the expert witnesses we've had throughout all of time for court proceedings. Because what you're saying is unless a court orders it, and that's what you just said, or the APA said, then therefore expert witnesses cannot do an evaluation based on an observation of the medical records. Insurance companies cannot do evaluations solely based on medical records where their doctors rendering professional opinions. So at the end of the day, you are essentially saying that unless someone has directly evaluated it, this whole medical system we have, this whole legal system we have, is null and void.
I'm not saying.
No, yes, you are, sir. No, you are.
Well, give me a second, and I'll give you more than a second. What I'm saying and what I am reading to you is a rule by your organization that takes into account that there could be court orders that would permit the exact kind of evaluation that you say I'm eliminating.
And I think we're going in circles because I think I just said that means expert witness testimony would not be allowed, and the branch of forensic psychiatry would be especially hindered. And we know the branch of forensic psychiatry does not prohibit that. So I am a member of the APA. That doesn't necessarily mean every single thing they put in there, everybody has to uncategorically agree with, because clearly that's not the case.
Did you agree in your deposition that the professional opinions you rendered were inconsistent with the Goldwater Rule?
Yeah, my first was inconsistent. If we're saying that if the Goldwater Rule says, and I very much said that during deposition, that the Goldwater Rule was made for presidents and public figures such as that, but regardless of that, because that's what it was made for. It's not made for Hollywood, but I'll even take that Mr. Depp's a public figure. What I'm saying to you is that the Goldwater Rule is saying we cannot do any expert witness testimony in our field. That is exactly what the Goldwater Rule is saying based on exactly what you read. And I'm just telling you what you are saying that rule encompasses.
What I'm asking you, sir, is did you comply with the ethical requirements of the APA when rendering the professional opinions that you've rendered today?
It is a requirement of the APA. It is not the requirement of the APA. Secondarily,
so the answer is no.
Secondarily, again, in order to not, we wasted our whole morning because there was an expert witness before me. There's an expert witness everyone brought in. So all I'm saying to you, that means the whole field of medical legal law is corrupt and unethical for engaging in an act that the APA clearly says we should not do. So if you're saying that, then the answer is yes, I'm agreeing with that statement.
You're agreeing that the APA would deem your testimony and your professional opinions rendered unethical.
I am saying you are saying that I'm an expert witness. I'm saying as an expert witness, and solely as an expert witness, that guideline is permitting that from occurring. I would say then that the whole field of expert witness testimony, again, would be disavowed by what you are quoting in the Goldwater Rule. And we know that's not the case, because if it was, we would not be allowed to do it.
And you said the rule was for presidents, right? And
that was initially
figures.
for presidents, yes.
Well, and the name of the rule came from that. But the rule says it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion about an individual. That's right, sir. It's not just presidents, it's not public figures, it's individuals.
Funny, it was named after them. According to your logic, if you don't put something in the title, it's not true. That's what you told me this morning, I believe, about my intimate partner violence. So what I would say to you then, sir, is that if you say this about an individual, again, any court would have to render an expert witness testimony invalid. Any doctor that reviews charts would have to render it invalid. I can go on the list of docs that do not see or interview patients directly, and that's a violation. So basically, you are saying that unless you do a direct clinical evaluation, then all of the field of forensic psychiatry and all of managed care is doing an unethical violation because we are not seeing the presence. We deny patients medications all the time without seeing them. We deny patients treatments, unfortunately, without seeing them. And I'm on the receiving end of that. So the answer to your question, again, unless you are saying to me that all of this is unethical, which is what you are saying. This is how I'm interpreting what you are saying to me. That unless you do the evaluation directly yourself, therefore, it could not be considered ethical. And I'm telling you how that's applicable to not just expert law, but also managed care. It's applicable to multiple branches of medicine. Hospital duration of hospitalization stay, they get evaluated. So tell me where you want me to end this.
Well,
Sir.
why don't we talk about what you just testified to? Because I didn't ask you anything about that. I asked you whether, under this rubric, under this principle of medical ethics, have you acted unethically? Yes or no?
No. As an expert witness, I have not acted unethically. And if you want the jury to believe that expert witnesses are unethical, then I guess that's for them to decide.
Yes
that's
or no,
for them
sir.
to
You
decide.
said no. Let's go to the next question.
Okay.
Right? Psychiatric diagnosis occurs in the context of an evaluation based on thorough history-taking examination and where applicable collated or collateral information. You'll agree with that?
I believe I said that earlier, yes.
Yeah. And it's a departure from the methods of the profession to render an opinion without an examination and without conducting an evaluation in accordance with the standards of psychiatric practice, correct?
Well, again, by the way, for the record, intimate partner violence is not a psychiatric diagnosis. I'll start with that. Substance usage by themselves is not a psychiatric diagnosis. If you want to cut to the chase, psychiatry is not a diagnosis of that. Narcissistic personality traits is not a diagnosis. Ergo, I am basically commenting on the things that were brought to me, which are not diagnosis. But an evaluation, if I was going to treat a patient or anyone here, those are the steps I would take.
We, I think, started with the notion that this rule applies broader than diagnoses. It applies to professional opinions.
I believe you
you've
just
rendered
quoted
professional opinions relative to narcissistic personality traits, haven't you, sir? Relative to Mr. Depp.
Again,